Hey everyone, welcome back to Introduction to Contemporary China A. In this very brief video, I want to introduce you to the way that Xi Jinping's leadership has made sense of ideology, specifically the kind of issues that they have pushed in order to establish first and foremost the China Dream idea, and then also this concept of 12 core socialist values. So we're going to be taking a look at the mainstream CCP ideology at this moment in time, and then I want to also conclude by giving you some ideas of how the Chinese population has been reacting, has been taking these ideas and running with them in various different ways. So let's take a look at that. At the heart of Chinese Communist Party ideology under Xi Jinping lies the idea of the China Dream or Chinese Dream. I prefer the word China Dream because the Chinese word is literally 中国梦. This is an official propaganda poster that promotes the China Dream, and it makes it clear that this is a dream that 1.3 billion Chinese people have in common, and it uses the iconography of nationalism, so the flag in the top, Tiananmen Gate, Tiananmen, the Tian'an Gate, and the various ethnic groups that populate China, the 56 ethnic minorities, to make it clear that this is a common ambition for all Chinese people. The China Dream idea got launched in 2012 in November, just after Xi Jinping had taken office, and it became particularly influential in 2013 when the Chinese Communist Party propaganda department launched a widespread campaign with posters and videos and many more media items in order to establish this as the core guiding element of Xi Jinping's tenure. Of course, none of this really tells us yet what the China Dream really is, and for the first couple of years of Xi Jinping's rulership, many people have been saying that it really is just a vapid term that gets filled with whatever is necessary at any given moment in time. Indeed, the exact meaning of the China Dream has remained largely ambiguous, and this is intentional because this way then also local authorities and local propaganda departments can run with that idea within the confines of a relatively broadly established conception of national glory and national stability. And in fact, many of the posters that then came out in 2013 were establishing a narrative of China's great power status internationally and a harmonious and peaceful society domestically. This is one of these posters. You can see the little seal script on the bottom right-hand corner. That marks it as a 中国梦 poster, so a China Dream poster. And it is, I think, indicative of the many different styles that have come together to promote the China Dream, because this isn't exactly the kind of iconography, the kind of imagery that we expect from a Communist Party propaganda series. In fact, it might be better to not describe this as a single series of posters, but rather as a large campaign within which various kinds of communities, various kinds of local government agencies decided to then put out their own series. This one, for instance, the poster I photographed here in 2013, comes from Shanghai, and specifically from the southwestern district of Xujiahui, in case you're ever there, the area that borders on the French concession. And you can see here also how the aesthetic then is somewhat different than the aesthetic of the poster I showed you just earlier. So the imagery here is already a little bit southern in terms of the landscape painting, and it uses and combines various different tropes from all sorts of ideological backgrounds. It is not a straightforward revolutionary poster. It has, for instance, at the top a key word, a key phrase from Confucian classics, which is 大德, which means great virtue, and it describes China in these terms as greatly virtuous. I am showing you this poster because I think it is quite representative of the way that the campaigns as a whole brought together various different traditions, ranging from Confucian ideas to Republican-era aesthetics to Buddhist ideas to no small amount of nationalism, and then all brought them together to make contemporary statements. This poster, for instance, if you read Chinese, at the very bottom makes the case for the establishment nationwide for civilized city districts. I think all of this together should give us pause to not jump to conclusions when we see, for instance, a deeply communist revolutionary poster in China, or a poster that really harks back to Confucian ideas, and then assume that it is an indication of the Chinese Communist Party being either extremely Maoist or extremely Confucian. Really what Xi Jinping's propaganda has been doing is ticking all the boxes that could possibly come up in terms of the ideologies that Chinese people today find important. So really what has been happening under Xi Jinping, and to be honest, already in the leadership generation before that, is that the Chinese Communist Party has been trying to establish itself as what in German would be called a Volkspartei. I think that might also work in Dutch, Volkspartei. So the idea of a true people's party, one that is so broadly established that it appeals to everyone. Beyond this campaign, there has also been a move to push a particular understanding of socialism, to reinvent socialism for the 21st century, and that has happened through the 12 core socialist values. These are very cleverly put together because each socialist value consists of 2 Chinese characters, and then they form the kind of array that you see on this poster across 3 different levels of relevance. One is the national level, that's the top one, 国家. The middle one is 社会, is the social level, and the lower level is 公民, so that is the citizen level. So at the national level, 2 concepts pop back up that I've mentioned before. One is civility. We just saw it in the poster, how that was demanding civil city districts. But I've also mentioned harmony, 和谐, in the last video about how Confucian thought gets mined for particular kinds of conceptions. And then we, interestingly enough, have 2 additional concepts here. One that you might not necessarily associate with Communist Party ambitions, but it is democracy. It's just that the Communist Party has something slightly different in mind when it means democracy, or it says democracy. It means, of course, democracy under the leadership of the Communist Party and democratic centralism. And finally, there is prosperity, which explains or which ties in with this ambition to create a minimally and moderately wealthy society in China. At the societal level, we are then confronted with values like freedom, equality, justice, and rule of law, where again I have to point out that a concept like freedom has a very different meaning in the Chinese context because it doesn't mean political freedom. It mainly gets interpreted as the freedom to consume, the freedom to make certain life choices, so choices of lifestyle in particular, but it doesn't mean the same thing that people in America would, for example, associate with the term. And finally, the values that people are individually supposed to follow as citizens are patriotism, and I'm going to be able to say quite a bit more about this when we talk about nationalism in the next 2 videos, dedication, integrity, and friendship. So these are sort of personal responsibilities that are supposed to guide people to create a better society. So these are some of the central ideas that have come out of the Chinese Communist Party under Xi Jinping's leadership. You may vaguely recall from the second set of lectures that we discussed the standing committee of the Politburo and some of the members there, and there was one person in particular called Wang Huning, who is responsible for many of these ideological innovations. But so far we've only talked about the Chinese Communist Party perspective. What happens when citizens interact with these ideas? Well, since the Chinese Communist Party leadership has decided to leave much of the interpretation of these concepts up to the general public and outsource it to grassroots, we then see interpretations that can vary widely. This is again a photo I took in Shanghai, this time a few years later in 2017, at a high school where the walls outside the high school were painted in keeping with the core socialist values. So here we can presume that the school also had party cadres, that they were in charge of deciding that this was a useful way to promote CCP culture and CCP ideology, and that they then interpreted that ideology in their own ways that suited their context in Shanghai. You then end up with the kind of interpretation where freedom, 自由, is quite literally the freedom to go shopping during a sale. And this is interesting because propaganda experts in the Chinese Communist Party may secretly have this kind of imagery at the back of their mind. They may be okay with insinuating that freedom really translates into shopping and luxury and so on, but it is most certainly not the kind of interpretation that people who are more on the left-wing side of the spectrum would approve of. And so the new left would most certainly throw their hands up and be extremely frustrated with this sort of understanding of socialist core values. So this is what happens when a core CCP value gets taken up by a local organization and interpreted in that context. And remember that this is in fact a state organization, it's a high school, so this is still within the realm of official interpretation. What happens when private citizens get their hands on many of these concepts is a whole nother matter and can be quite the free-for-all, because Chinese individual people have very different ideas of whether something like freedom should be interpreted in this way or some other, and they have a very different understanding, for instance, of tradition than the Chinese Communist Party. Let me show you an image that also illustrates this. This is a photo I took in 2015 in Kyoto in Japan, where you can see various people walking around in kimonos, or in traditional Japanese clothing, as they're exploring the city. What is interesting about this image is that the vast majority of people who are dressed this way are not actually Japanese. You see sometimes Japanese people dressed in traditional Japanese clothing, but not in these areas, which are decidedly touristic. Instead, the vast majority of these people are Chinese. They have traveled to Japan for their vacation, and they've gone to one of the many places where you can rent this clothing, and they've decided to dress up in traditional garb for the entire day as they go about their business. At the time when I was taking this photo, it was particularly intriguing because there were still remnants of a very recent dispute between China and Japan, where Japan had been maligned in the Chinese media and by Chinese propaganda, starting in 2012 and lasting up until this moment. And still you saw all these Chinese tourists not just traveling to Japan, but actually emulating a particular fantastic vision of what they thought Japanese tradition was all about. While these kind of tourist activities may be mostly innocent, and in a place like this and at a time like this, they may even inspire some hope that there is possibility for cultural reconciliation and respect, not all of these activities are so benign. In mainland China itself, you also see an increase in popularity for tradition, specifically for Han tradition and the clothing that people wore, whether it was during the Han Dynasty or other important dynasties like the Song or the Tang. This is then a reinterpretation and reappropriation of cultural elements that people consider to be traditional and that stand in for certain glorious times in Chinese history. Now you might say this is simply a fashion statement or a choice of lifestyle, but is it really, or is something else here going on? Well, a colleague of mine has written a book about the Han clothing movement, and he has found that many of the people who promote this kind of lifestyle tend to be fairly conservative, if not outright what we would call far right. Here is a quote from that book from Kevin Carrico's The Great Han, in which he has interviewed Han clothing enthusiasts, and one of them from Guangzhou, from the southern city of Guangzhou, said this about his understanding of culture and of China, what China is all about. So he says, there are parts of Guangzhou, like Xiaobei, so that's a city district, that are overrun by these black devils, heigui. I've been there, have you? You have to leave before nightfall to be safe. I've seen people laying there in the street, these big black devils passed out with a needle in their arm, foaming at the mouth. If they don't have money to buy their drugs, they'll beat you and rob you. And if they need a woman, they'll just grab one off the streets and do with her as they please. They'll share her with their friends and give her AIDS. Places like this, like Xiaobei, they're in China, right? There's no debate whether Xiaobei is part of China, but the people of China have to avoid Xiaobei for their own safety. This is our own home country and we can't go there. So again, we have to qualify quotes like this by pointing out that, of course, not all Han clothing enthusiasts are necessarily this chauvinistically racist. At the same time, we should also, again, emphasize that this is a minority position in China, but nevertheless, it is telling that this harking back to traditions, this reinventing of a particular kind of national history is also tied to this sort of in-group, out-group thinking and the racism that then comes with it. With all of these caveats in place, and of course with the constant reminder that racism exists in any society and that Europeans and Americans certainly have to look at themselves before criticizing others in terms of how incredibly racist their societies can at times be, we should also acknowledge that China has a racism problem, and that is particularly true if you're black or if you're Muslim. I'm going to show you here a video which depicts events from 10 years ago, from 2010, from a singer who was singled out for her heritage. So let's take a quick look at that.
Racism in China, it's not something you often hear about, but when one young woman stepped into the national spotlight on a reality TV show, much of the attention quickly turned to talk about the color of her skin. Emily Chang reports from Shanghai in a story you will only see here on CNN.
相信上海，上海加油！ It started with the lure of the glitz, the glamour, the dream of being China's next pop star. But Lo Jing's instant fame had its consequences. She was born in Shanghai to a Chinese mother and an African-American father who she's never met.
1岁, 1 year old. So cute.
Growing up with a single mom, 20-year-old Lo Jing says she had a normal life, good friends, and only rarely felt out of place. Sometimes people on the street would ask me, why do you speak Chinese so well? I'd say, because I'm Chinese. When Lo Jing stepped into the national spotlight on a Chinese reality show called Go Oriental Angel, she got attention not necessarily because of her talent, but because of how she looked. Hosts fondly called her Chocolate Girl and Black Pearl. The Chinese media fixated on her skin color. Angry netizens vented online, saying she never should have been born and telling her to get out of China, sparking a bitter debate about race. In many respects, China can be considered a very homogenous society. More than 90% of the population is Han Chinese. So people who look different stand out. At first, I cried a lot, she says. Then I got angry, and finally, I just started to ignore it. Lo Jing's background became national gossip. Show producers convinced her mom to appear on air, the most private details of their life becoming painfully public. Lo Jing didn't ask me about her dad until she was 16, she told the audience. I cried, and she never asked me again. But as the show went on, so did Lo Jing, listening to Beyonce, her favorite artist, hanging out with classmates, and going to school. I was so angry, says her drama teacher, but she said she wasn't letting these things get to her heart. Fans continued to vote for her. The judges praised her confidence. Lo Jing was eliminated before the finale, but not without a powerful parting message. I think I'm the same as all the girls here, except for my skin color. We share the same stage and the same dream. Emily Chang, CNN, Shanghai.
Now, all of this is, of course, extremely worrying. At the same time, it is worth pointing out that these are ultimately minority positions, that not the vast majority of Chinese are racist in this way, but it is a very vocal group of people who voice these opinions. And that is also not in the interest of the Chinese Communist Party, which is trying to present itself as a guarantor of South-South relations. And you may recall one of the first articles we read about this, about how the PRC is supposed to be a champion for the so-called developing world. At the same time, the state has a very bizarre relationship with race itself, and it is an open question of whether that very relationship is priming people to take on some of these egregious views. This is an image from Chinese Central Television's Spring Festival Gala in 2018. The annual Spring Festival Gala is one of the most watched events every year on Chinese television. It is the sort of event where the entire family who has come together for the Spring Festival, for the New Year Eve celebrations, sits in front of the television, eats food, and watches what is going on in their country. As such, the Spring Festival Gala is always a major propaganda vehicle that the Chinese Communist Party uses through the broadcaster Chinese Central Television to communicate to the public more broadly what China is all about at that moment in time. The show consists of sketches, of dance numbers, and all of these are tied in one way or another to current affairs and the sort of things that people are debating throughout that year. It's kind of a review of everything that happened in the last year. It is then also not too surprising that a gala like this would have very clear political components, like, for example, sketches or songs that depict China in the world, South-South relations, or, like in this particular image, China in Africa. So here the propagandists decided to put a Chinese man in blackface on the stage to dance and sing next to a monkey. You can probably imagine that this kind of imagery drew heavy criticism, not just from people outside of China, but also from a lot of Chinese citizens who are watching this on screen and were just as appalled as you and I might be. So when the official Chinese broadcaster in the year 2018 decides to depict intercultural relations in such a racist fashion, should we then really be surprised when at least some online commentators in China take on exactly that kind of racism and refine it for their own personal uses and then voice it against anyone who they see as different? These kind of processes are deeply entangled with nationalism, an ideology that places the idea of the nation at the center of pretty much everything. And in the next few videos, we're going to talk more about what nationalism is, how it works, and how it plays out in China. The Chinese state's official understanding of how people should make sense of the nation is captured in one of the 12 socialist core values that I already mentioned earlier, and that is patriotism. In this understanding, citizens are supposed to be rational patriots, and they're supposed to be peaceful and not malign others. And yet the state has already set up, whether it is during the Spring Festival Gala or through its many news broadcasts, the idea that there's an outside to China that is ultimately malign in various ways. A good example of this is how state propaganda often depicts Japan as a negative force in the region and homes in on the many different things that happen in Japan that are egregious to Chinese audiences, and the result can then be outright hatred from Chinese citizens. This is an advertisement from 2003 by Toyota, in which the car company from Japan was trying to sell its Land Rover in China through this kind of vision and this kind of iconography. The slogan at the top reads, "Prado, you cannot help but respect it," and Prado in the Chinese characters also translates to hegemonic way. The slogan alone would have probably already been enough to make quite a few people in China upset, but the fact that the two lions, both symbols of Chinese culture, bow and salute to a Japanese car, that was simply too much for people at that time. Many were then reminded of the Japanese invasion and the various atrocities that Japanese troops committed in China at that time, and they got extremely angry, and the Toyota company had to apologize and pull this advertisement. There are other occasions where people in China get extremely upset with Japan. I mentioned the 2012 event. I'm going to talk about those in another video. But some of the results are then angry vitriol from China, especially in online forums, that can take the form of this. So during the 2011 disaster that swept across Japan, the triple disaster, earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear breakdown, nuclear meltdown, some Chinese online commentators were gleeful at the suffering that they were watching on TV. And this is one example of someone commenting, "Serves them right, may Japan be destroyed by earthquakes." Events like this can then also inspire moments of reflection in China, where, for example, egregious toxic commentary like the one I just showed you leads to debate among online commentators, some of which are fighting back against the toxicity. This is an example. So here someone is also saying, "Good, excellent," looking at this earthquake, and someone else is responding saying, "The era of resisting the Japanese has already passed, so stop gloating at others' misfortune. No matter what, the Japanese are also people." The dispute then continues with the first writer responding by claiming that the other commentator doesn't really understand national shame, to which that commentator responds that he despises commentary like this, and all of this then ends in a very racist statement by the very first commentator questioning whether his antagonist actually has Chinese DNA or maybe Japanese DNA. So this is the shape that nationalist commentary can at times take in China, and we are going to return to some of these themes and unpack nationalism in more detail in the coming videos. I want to conclude here by pointing out that these kind of sentiments are deeply rooted across the region, and that they can often affect not just popular opinion, but also international relations more broadly. Now, I don't normally show Pew Research Center data because some of that research isn't particularly good. We always have to read it with a bit of a grain of salt, but in the general tendencies, probably this research isn't too far off. Here, in this particular study, the Pew Research Center asked people from various Asian countries how warmly or less favorably they feel about other countries. And I just want to draw your attention here to the fact that the degree of positivity from China towards Japan lies at 12 out of 100. Conversely, the attitudes in Japan are even lower at 9 out of 100 towards China. All of this is from 2015, so this is the same year in which I took the photo of Chinese tourists running around Kyoto wearing kimono. How to make sense of these contradictions is then an open question and something we are going to hopefully be able to address in the coming videos. These examples, I hope, have given you some impression of how nationalism can often be intertwined in complicated ways with conceptualizations of race, concepts of self and other, and how difficult it must be to design and manage a national identity top-down as the Chinese Communist Party is trying to do. Nationalism is in fact an extremely impactful ideology. It is a complicated concept, and that is why in the next video we're going to be covering nationalism in much more detail. So I'll see you then.